Hello, South by Southwest. We are really excited to have a great conversation today about the future of immersive technology and how to ensure that it is designed to be inclusive and available to all. Before we launch into our discussion, let's take a moment to let you know who's going to be speaking today. I'll do a quick intro and then they can elaborate when they're going to speak. But our first person, if we look at our next slide, is Christian Vogler, and he is director of the Technology Access Program at Gallaudet. We also have Andrew Icke. He is the CO Owl and self-described cable slinger from Alchemy Labs. And then Christopher Patno, who is the head of accessibility programs and disability inclusion at Google. My name is Liz Hyman. I'm the CEO of the XR Association. We're a nonprofit trade association representing the broad ecosystem of the XR industry. We have some great founding members who are the leading hardware manufacturers and technology platforms in this space. But let me take a quick moment to make sure before we dive in that we're all familiar with the immersive technology that we're going to be talking about. First of all, XR is an umbrella term for virtual, augmented, and mixed reality, and even some immersive technologies that have yet to be invented. But let me start with what we're talking about today. So virtual reality just popped up on our screen. This is a full immersion experience into a new digitally generated setting. It replaces the user's view with a digitally generated view, and it's usually done through a head-mounted display. There are some two-dimensional computer virtual worlds that you can experience as well. I've seen this in a conference setting where people can participate both in 2D and 3D, but obviously 2D not as immersive. But just to get you in the mood, let's say you've got a headset on and you are, deeply engaged in a trip that you've never taken before to the Dolomite Mountains, and you are in a 360 environment. You are looking around at the mountain range and the sky is blue, and you have some friends that you're with on this incredible hiking experience. This is immersive. This is virtual. The next piece that we're going to talk about is augmented reality. And this is a little bit different. This is where you have a full understanding of your physical world, but there is information that is overlaid onto that field of view. We see this in a lot of different ways. I love the retail applications where you can try before you buy, sit in your own living room and look at a sofa that you might want to purchase and how it looks with the painting on the wall. And this can be done either through a mobile device or through a head-mounted display. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about mixed reality. And this is merging the physical and virtual worlds to produce new environments and visualizations where physical and digital objects and users, they're all coexisting and interacting in real time. We've seen this now, for example, in manufacturing settings where teams can collaborate on a prototype of an engine that they're working on, and it doesn't matter if they're dispersed across different geographic locations. We also see it in real-time assist opportunities where the expert may not be on the field, but they can help that individual fix the engine if they need something like that done. I think the exciting thing as we kick off this conversation is that the comfort and power of the devices is going up. The cost is starting to come down, particularly in the VR space. Consumer content is becoming more varied and compelling, and leaders in enterprise are starting to understand the value and the return on investment of XR in their businesses. And we're starting to see some strong indicators of greater adoption. And in March, the XR Association partnered with a law firm, last March, that is, with a law firm called Perkins Coie and a VC firm Boost to survey XR industry leaders and where they think the technology is headed. And then in September, we did a benchmarking exercise. We talked to executives across 6 key industry segments: healthcare, education, public safety, manufacturing, workforce training, and retail, just to kind of benchmark where they are on growth and adoption of XR technology. So I wanted to share with you a couple of slides from this latter study. If you move to the next slide, in our survey of industry executives, a key takeaway is that the level of knowledge among these leaders is actually quite good. 75% of respondents had heard about XR, 94% thought that XR can provide useful applications to its business. If I move on to the next slide, another important takeaway is that 3 and 4 leaders expect to dedicate more resources to XR in the next 5 years. And while all of the industries have a healthy expectation in this regard, manufacturing, job training, retail, and healthcare were particularly strong. And then also, because we've all been living in this COVID world, we wanted to see how COVID might specifically impact the adoption of XR. And almost every sector felt that XR had a role to play in their recovery post-pandemic. And there were two applications: immersive training and learning outcomes, and enabling better communications, collaboration were leading areas where they thought XR would be impactful and help their industry recover from the effects of COVID-19. So I truly believe that XR is the computing platform of the future, but that future is rapidly approaching. And that gets us to our topic today. I think it's vital that before XR is truly widespread, that we work now to make sure that the technology is accessible and assistive. And with that as a bit of a scene setter, I'm really pleased to turn to Christian Vogler, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the current challenges the deaf and hard of hearing community finds with XR, and what role the community plays in making this technology more inclusive from the get-go. To make that point, Christian has prepared a quick video that we're going to show now, and then he'll address it on the other side.
Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about accessibility in the world of XR. It's a very important issue for the deaf and hard of hearing community in terms of access. As you could see in this video I recently showed you, I had a lot of fun with my son making this video. And that's because I'm excited about the potential that's there for accessibility in the realm of XR. I intentionally started with a sign language example. As you all can see, sign language makes a lot of use of 3D space, and this video is a poor substitute for 3D face-to-face interaction. 3D space is very important for sign language, and as you know, fatigue can happen when you're trying to look at a screen all of the time. For example, Zoom fatigue doesn't just exist for spoken languages, it also exists for sign language after staring at 2D images all day. It's just exhausting. So my hope is to see a lot of sign language content arrive in XR for teaching, gaming, and also especially for communication. Communication currently has a big unresolved problem. You saw in the last part of the video that I just showed you that VR gear also blocks half of the face. This half is very important in terms of eye gaze and eyebrow movements because they carry a lot of grammatical and prosodic information. And so the challenge that I want to pose here is, picture a VR sign-to-sign language communication system. How can we design it and the equipment in such a way that we can convey both parties' facial expressions to each other? If we can solve that problem, then we've got the next best thing to a Star Wars hologram. we need to make sure that participants can see one another. It's going to be great. Like I said, it will be like a Star Wars hologram in terms of how amazing it will be. So now we're going to talk a bit about captions. My fellow panelists will have a lot more to say about this particular topic, but there's some detail in the captions that people might have missed. With this kind of immersive experience, you have two problems. The first is making sure that captions don't block the important stuff, and that's why captions that follow the head movements may not be the best. In this game, captions have been placed in the world in a way that they grab your attention, but they don't block anything. Second, if there's a lot of action, captions with only 2 lines compete for visual attention, and you miss what's happening. You can focus only on one or the other. So if this game has a lot of action happening around in the environment and the captions are directly in front of you, you have to look from side to side trying to keep up with the captions, which makes it difficult to focus on the action in the game. So it would be helpful to have the captions in a location that allows accessibility to still happen and gives the person using the XR device time to see the captions. When you're immersed in a VR experience, sound is also a major environmental cue. For example, if someone walks up to you while you have this gear on and they want to talk to you, or if someone's at the door, let's say that you missed that cue. You can literally jump out of your skin. Deaf people and hard of hearing people use visual and tactile cues quite often in place of sound cues. So we want to think about how we could apply these issues when you're immersed in the virtual environment. One big problem that you may have noticed in the video is that I couldn't use my cochlear implants and the VR headset together. In that headset, you can adjust the screen and the lenses, but you can't adjust how it attaches to your head. So that means that I have to choose between the VR experience and sound. As you can see here, I've got my cochlear implants, but putting on the headset at the same time is impossible. As you could just see, the headset is not able to be adjusted. And so it's not possible to use my cochlear. That means that I have to, again, make that choice. Do I want to wear my cochlear implants or do I want to have access to sound? I can't have both at the same time. So I cannot wear the headset while also wearing my cochlear implants. In the past, the SNI design that was worn with the headset was able to work, but it's not always compatible. The design team doesn't think about these things when creating the headset. So there are also people who wear glasses in addition to a cochlear implant or glasses in general. And so those are things that have to be considered when thinking about the headband positioning and the design of the device from the beginning. And now I'd like to take a moment to take on some questions.
Great. Thank you, Christian. I noted at the top that you lead the Technology Access Program at Gallaudet, and I'm curious if you could say a little bit about that and also what the interaction is with industry, both hardware manufacturers and software developers, and how they can work with this program and elsewhere to address some of the things that you raised.
Yes, and sure, I do want to emphasize that it's very important to include people with disabilities in the design framework from the beginning. Access to technology is vital, and that is going to require a discussion from the very beginning. Now, at Gallaudet University, I do have a group of people who are helping with that. We are in the stages of getting a project going, set up, and we are looking to collaborate with those in the industry so that deaf and hard of hearing individuals can have a say in the design process to ensure that access happens. It's an exchange of information between the designers and the deaf and hard of hearing community. So I think the more that they work together and the more collaboration there is between the industry and the deaf and hard of hearing communities, we will see an improved product. That feedback from the deaf and hard of hearing community is vital so that the designers can make sure that they're going through testing processes and ensuring that accessibility happens. So in October of 2021, we have a website that is going to be coming out that's created by the group. And I'm really looking forward to what's to come as more products become accessible to the deaf and hard of hearing community. So again, look out for that website to launch in October 2021, which is a collaborative effort between the industry and deaf and hard of hearing consumers.
Christian, that's really important. We're going to be looking for that. And this sort of transitions now to Andrew Ike. Andrew, is someone who's on the creative software side. How do you think about some of the things that Christian just raised in this broader idea of inclusivity and accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, from the software side, it's up to us to make sure that we, integrate with the hardware as best we can. So certain things, we don't have as much control over, right? We can ask very nicely of the headset manufacturers to, kind of account for the physicality of the device. But otherwise, with things such as the subtitles and other accessibility features, I think that, we've really been kind of hitting on the key point here, which is to find folks in the disability community with, various disabilities to come in and actually test these things. So you can make sure that you're not just making assumptions, that what you're doing is actually accounting for this. And if you're making video games, this is especially easy because it's not too hard to convince people to come in and play your video game. So, we reach out to various groups locally. So we're out of Austin, Texas. So there's a school for the deaf here, but there might be a group like that near where you are. We have personal connections to people. We kind of reach out to our personal connections. We have the groups like XRA and XR Access that help us make some of those connections. And then we also just use social media, right? If you just put things out there, and then any of those resources are great. We put out, we made a simple Google form. You can make any kind of form and just say, hey, do you want to beta test our games? Here's the sign up sheet. And then we go from there and we build a list of people and kind of have a library of folks, across the spectrum. And this is for disabilities, but also helps you for your games in general, because you should be testing with a wide variety of people. So.
Hey, and Andrew, I understand you put together a really cool video. Maybe we could show that right now.
Yeah, I think that covers the kind of grounds of how we approach accessibility in general at Alchemy.
At Alchemy Labs, we are deeply committed to creating VR for everyone. This includes pushing the state of the art of accessibility in XR. As the medium evolves, it's important for us to start designing accessible experiences from the onset. While we are unable to create a set of best practices due to the ongoing explosive growth of the industry, we are able to share some of our current designs. These techniques will greatly expand the possible user space of XR experiences, and we'd love to see more developers adopt these. Our innovative subtitling system, Gloss, was created with an XR-first mindset. Gloss intelligently displays subtitles to the users in a way that feels natural to XR. Great care is taken to make the subtitles as readable as possible while prioritizing the comfort of the player. If you would like a deep dive into Gloss, the subtitles and XR talk from the Games Accessibility 2020 conference covers the technical details of the project. We design our games to not require reading text. Every piece of critical information is also displayed as an icon and voiceover. This has the added benefit of making our game more accessible to non-English speakers without requiring extra localization effort. That being said, we still strongly recommend localizing your content if you can afford to. We do extensive testing from the seated position to ensure our games are accessible for players who must remain seated. We use this testing to adjust the layout of our worlds to better accommodate seated players. We design all our surfaces and interactive stations to be adjustable to help ergonomically accommodate anyone playing the game. We also developed an intelligent object retrieval system to return items that players may be unable to reach. Of course, we allow a player to chuck away an object if they want to. Having complicated controls that involve two hands is a limiting factor for accessibility. Our games have a diegetic design. The controllers only use a small number of buttons, and the interactions focus on the object's presence in the world instead of complicated button combinations. Yet, we still face the issue of users who can only use a single controller. This led us to develop our one-handed mode. This mode automatically activates when only one controller is connected to the hardware. Our game then modifies itself slightly to account for the timing and presence of a single controller. To the player, this appears seamless and has the added benefit of also assisting players who have a single controller run out of battery. We take great care to address the needs of our players who are colorblind. We work to minimize the amount of data that relies exclusively on color cues by using a combination of text, audio, and iconography. We test with toolkits and colorblind players to ensure we are not missing anything. In the case where color is a required attribute for the experience, we developed a set of patterns. These patterns always correspond with a specific color in the world, so something that is orange will have the same pattern on a fish or a climbing wall rock. This lets our colorblind players play the game even if they cannot distinguish any color whatsoever. The needs of accessibility and the design of your XR experience can be complementary if you include the right features. Shorter human mode is a feature that raises the internal player's scale. In other words, it makes the player larger, allowing them to reach higher and farther in the virtual environment. It was originally designed for players who could not reach high up items in our game, and through its use has expanded to allow object distance to be less of an obstacle for players without sacrificing the design of the game. There is still a lot more work to be done to make XR accessible from the ground up. We will keep innovating and encourage everyone working in the medium to do so as well. Playtest with users who have disabilities, share your findings and techniques, and together we can forge an accessible future.
Andrew, that's fantastic. And there's a lot of really rich information there. And it shows the power of the developer community to help make this technology a lot more inclusive. And I'm wondering, in your experience, do you think that the developer community is embracing the concept of inclusive design? And if not, are there incentives that we need to put in place or more attention that we need to get out there? How do we start getting people really engaged in this effort?
So, yeah, I do think that the community is getting more engaged with each kind of year over year. When I first started giving these talks, people didn't even think about accessibility. In fact, the only thing accessible that anyone did was build seated mode. And that was because all developers sit at their desks. So they were doing it because it was a thing they were experiencing. They didn't want to move back, stand up. But they weren't even considering what it meant to put in subtitles or colorblind or any of those things. So to me, the largest part of this thing is a communications problem. And so talks like this, the guide that XRA put out, are great. The other thing that happened recently is Oculus has these things called VRCs, which is the set of technical checks you have to pass to get your app published on their store. And Quest being one of the largest stores for VR content today, they actually have 9 different VRCs that they've put out. Now, they're all optional, and it'd be great if they were required, but they will test your game and tell developers about it, giving them specific guidelines, such as, this app should support multiple locomotion styles when possible, or can be used in seated or standing, right? They specifically say those things. So it's a lot of communications effort, and then a lot of just sharing kind of how-tos, right? The more that we at Alchemy put out these videos and we as a group start talking about the techniques, the hardest part in a lot of this technology is the design part, not the implementation, going through the multiple iterations and failing again and then succeeding finally.
And I wanted to ask you one other question, and it's something just at the end of the slide here, really testing this with persons with disabilities, right? And how are you at Alchemy connecting with the PWD community? What's the advice to the developer community on getting that done? And Christian, raised this as well.
Yeah, I think, I kind of mentioned it a little bit. And I think that the big thing is, putting yourself out there folks, especially if you're in the entertainment space, will want to play your experience. They want to try games and they're very willing to. But folks are also willing to try lots of different software if they feel exclusive or they feel that you're trying to make their community better. I think that you reach out locally to the resources. So we have the Austin School for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. You use your personal connections. I think that people would be shocked at how many people they know that actually have a disability, or how many people within one or two, kind of connections over, that we found lots and lots of people who fall into all sorts of different disability categories. And it was amazing how much we could get done with just the personal connections. But then additionally, we put things out on social media. We kind of ask for testers in general. We work with, there's some streamers and some other folks that are just really excited, that are kind of evangelizing things too, that are fully willing to play your game and give you feedback, or try your experience and give you feedback. So I think that those are kind of the ways that we engage. But that's I can't stress enough how that is the most critically important thing, right? You can design what you think is the best system, but it's not the best system until someone who you've been designing it for has tried your system, has given you the feedback, you've iterated on it, and they've been a participant in the process.
Cool. And, that now kind of transitions us over a little bit, Christopher, to your world. I think we've talked about how we learn about needs and functionality, how the XR industry and the developer community are responding. But you've had an amazing vantage point on collaborative standards development in this sphere. Can you share a little bit about this with us? Yep.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things is, as Andrew said, this is a really exciting time in the space of accessibility and immersive content like games and VR. There are more people talking about it, more people building with this in mind. Last year, The Last of Us 2 was the most accessible game ever released from a AAA. And what this was, it was a game that could be fully played by someone who was not sighted, start to finish, without any kind of support. That was unheard of 2 years ago. So the fact that they were able to bring this kind of deep thought to design and solving these problems is really impressive. And they did it in conjunction with people of different communities trying to solve it as a design problem, not as a checkbox that you have to do for any kind of legislative expectation. So what I've been doing in my free time is I've been passionate about captions. And there is I've put together a community group of people that are working to create some of these recommendations for captions in immersive and VR. And that's what I'll be sharing in my talk.
Why don't you jump right in and share those slides? So that would be awesome.
Again, my name is Christopher. My day job is head of accessibility programs and disability inclusion at a place called Google. You might have heard of us. Accessibility in XR in particular. A moment ago, I talked about gaming and this kind of work, but specifically in XR, it's a very exciting green field or blue field, in this case, opportunity. There's no legislation written, let alone enforced. So we have people like Andrew at Alchemy, or our friends at Microsoft with their research in Seeing VR, or Oculus driving expectations with their VRCs. People are taking it upon themselves to solve these problems because they recognize both the potential and the value of doing it. But the interesting thing is, when trying to come up with something like captions and virtual reality, is you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but you don't want to use the same wheel as what we had before. So this is what most people see subtitles are, because this is what subtitles are for about everything. Christian showed some really exciting ideas that's happened in Quill. Andrew had some great functionality in his work with the simulators. But this is what most people recognize as captions. It's been around since the 1970s. In fact, this standard first came to life in the French Chef in 1972 in Boston with WGBH. And then it became much more common in the 80s and 90s. The problem is it's so ubiquitous. You see it if you're at a bar watching games on the screen, you watch it at home. It's what we know. It's what we're comfortable with. So the interesting thing is, with all the research being done in terms of new ways of expressing it, the research shows most people like this. because it's probably what they're used to. So because they're used to it, we have to push ourselves to think beyond just the two-line space. There are interesting new things we need to think about in VR, and particularly relating to sound, like where does it come from and what kind of sounds are it? Those things matter. So in virtual reality, people and objects don't need to be in front of you. And if that's the case, how do you support it? One neat idea that was experimented with by the IMAC project out in Europe was to have a HUD, a heads-up display like we see here, that sort of showed you a map of where things are, telling you where they originate. As cool as this is, our research showed that there's actually a large cognitive load trying to figure out what does it mean, where are these things, and that made it even less useful especially for younger and older users. But what I'd love to see is this kind of innovative thinking about how do you share information in a non-traditional way. Another thing we need to think about is how do you share captions when you have multiple people? How do you show this association? Out at Alchemy, they did a great job. They had a little arrow that points towards whoever was speaking. This is an output from a prototype that we're working with, and we sort of show different people associated with different colors, because if people move, an interesting question is, do you want them to always move with you? Do you want it to snap? How do you track? Especially when dealing with video, there's some really interesting questions of how do you want to show this work? And another thing to think about is that not all sounds are critical to the experience. Some sounds are decorative. For example, birds or traffic noises, whereas others are critical, like gunfire and footsteps. So presenting these most important sounds is essential for an inclusive gaming experience. Well, here's a screenshot from Fortnite that I found in a discussion on this topic in Reddit. Say what you will about the game, Fortnite has done some really interesting work in this space and made it mainstream. What you see here is an indicator for footsteps, and with a location that tells you where it's coming from, or a gunfire indicator showing you where it comes from. So this is really neat work, and it's really happening in the mainstream. And by virtue of it happening in the mainstream, everybody gets to take advantage of it. This becomes the sort of curb cut in gaming. So to Anders and Christian's point, for us to be successful in this work, we need to be intentional. Inclusion must be intentional. It's not going to happen by accident. So to do this, you need to build with those people that you're trying to support. So this brings me to the work that we're doing in the Immersive Captions community group. So our community group was founded in October of 2019 as a result of the XR Access Symposium in July of that year, where Andrew and I actually met. Active participants are people who are of the deaf and hard of hearing community, people who are verbal or use sign, as well as some hearing people like myself. We have participants here from advocacy organizations like the National Association for the Deaf, industry like Google and Facebook, academia like our friends from Gallaudet, RIT, Sanford, Brandeis, and even content creators, both VR application platforms and VR production teams. And we meet every other week and with people from both sides of the Atlantic, and about 12 of us show up on a regular basis. And frankly, this is my favorite calls of the week. We talk about really interesting things. But the most important thing of what we're doing is we're bringing the lived experience of people together with people who are making the technologies. And we've done a lot of research here in terms of the best practice within games. In fact, Andrew even gave a lecture to us in terms of the work that they've done in simulators. We also have investigated different form factors and different aspects of sound and visual design. So what have we learned? Well, the first thing we learned is that taxonomy, words matter. If we were to talk about this, especially all over the Atlantic and the US and England, we need to have common words. So for example, headlocked versus world locked. If something is headlocked, when you move your head, the captions follow you around. It just stays where it is. If it's world locked, it sort of sits where it is. The image that Christian shared in Quill was world locked, where it stayed where it was because it's related to that spot. But coming up with these common words was really important. we came up with terms like appear in front and then fixed in scene. So it would appear gradually when necessary, and then it would be world locked, or fixed in position in scene, or fixed in scene and evenly replaced if we had things that happen in multiple places. You need to know how to talk about these things and create a common language. That was one of the first things that we learned. The most important thing that we learned, though, is there is no right answer. So our goal is to come up with recommendations on a default experience. What is the out-of-the-box experience? If we have 35 options of things you can choose from, no one's going to look at it. But give me 3 and then let people modify them. So this is our goal. So if you give someone a default experience, okay, it might not be the best thing. Let me try that other one. Oh, that's closer. Let me tweak it to make my choice. And this way we find we can create an experience that's relevant to everyone, because someone who may be deaf may also have some vision impairments. So they might need to have the captions be larger. This intersectionality of experience is really important and to take into consideration as you're designing anything. Another thing we realized is we needed to design within the HMD, or head-mounted display. If we're designing on a screen and testing on a screen, the 2-line captions makes a lot more sense. But the moment you put on the world in the HMD, it's really a different experience. So fortunately, we had Facebook, who was a partner with us, and they donated Oculus Go's to all of the members of our team who didn't have one already. That was a huge step forward. And then selecting the platform of critical importance. Facebook donated their Go's, but also Chris Hughes from University of Salford in the UK has created a fantastic tool that allows us to experiment with all the different kind of settings that we would want to use and play with. Here's an example of what his prototype is. Now, mind you, this is on his server. This is not a public tool, but I want to share you all the different kinds of things you want to think about when coming up with a thoughtful captions experience. So there's an awful lot to think about, and this research we're doing takes an awful lot of time. So where are we now? Right now, we're trying to source VR content that contains multiple simultaneous speakers, like in a cafe or a group conversation. And it's surprisingly hard because people don't shoot material like this. So we're actually going to probably have to create our own material, test material, to try to take advantage of it. And then, to give you a sense of one of the ideas that we have, you saw the image with 3 people there. Once you get past 2 people, the relationships are difficult to understand. So what idea we want to experiment with is to have a little transcript pop up with identifiers of people's names. And then if you, especially in a busy scene, it's much easier to sort of follow that than have to look around the screen, especially when people behind you are walking. We think the user experience will be a little bit better, but we have to experiment. We have to do this research. So we've come a long way in the past 18 months, and our goal is to actually share recommendations through the W3C, the World Wide Web Coalition, in June of this year. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you, Christopher. And given that you are bridging this world of industry innovation, sort of standards development groups, et cetera, I'm curious what you think is the right balance between industry best practices. Andrew mentioned the checklist, XR Association's guidelines on accessibility versus a more normative standard, which sort of, I think, represents that body of research and work that you're doing, but it then sort of locks in a certain standard that everybody must abide by. It can be updated, but it locks it in for a period of time. So I'm curious what you think that balance is.
I personally lean towards pushing towards best practices first and worry about the standards later. One of the problems with standards is because people look at them and write legislation pointing to them, think about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. Governments will point to that as this is what it means to be accessible. And if you have that kind of responsibility, it goes slowly because you have to get everybody to come and agree. So I think what happens is best practices will drive really quickly. They evolve faster. We're in a really exciting time right now in this industry where people are competing on accessibility. It is what people want to talk about, is what people want to shine on, because it's not just good for the people, it's also good business practice. It makes you look good, it makes your products better for everybody. So we want people to innovate towards best practices instead of just this lowest common denominator of standards. Captions, for example, is a standard. Everybody knows you need to have it. It's part of the WCAG guidelines. But how you show it, how you present your captions can become an innovative thing. It could be a determining factor for your product as opposed to someone else's. And the moment things become a race to excellence, we all win.
That's cool. I know we kind of touched on this earlier in our conversation, but I wanted to open this up to everybody and talk about making this an inclusive process more than just making our technology inclusive. And so we talked a little bit about, reaching out to people with disabilities. I think, forget who mentioned the XR Access Initiative, which is a volunteer effort to bring together people who care about this space to work on a number of different things. And I'm going to start with Christian, if that's okay. What would be your top thing about doing a better job of reaching out to all the communities that we need to reach out to and making them a part of this effort?
Well, I think the most important thing, I would say that the priority is to have to go to the community and talk with the community, because you have to make that effort to go to the community and learn and be open and respectful, first of all. I think that's the number one thing, because there's another perspective there to be heard. And the perspective from the community will be based on their own experience. In addition to that, I think it's vital to give them leadership roles, not just to get input, but also to recognize them as leadership in this area, because they know what is accessible. Hire hard of hearing people, hire deaf people to work together to put that input in and be involved in every step of the process. I think it's really important that respect for their experience is valued and that their perspective is involved on every level.
If I can just piggyback on top of this, I think it is extremely important that you have people in the communities be part of the teams that are doing the work. The thing that Christian showed about the VR headset that got in the way of the magnets of the cochlear implant would never happen if someone on the team wore one, because they would be able to show instantly the problem. So I can't support that statement strongly enough.
Great. Andrew, anything to add on that one?
I think from the other side, I think this is, if you had a number one, I would agree. So my number two is to try to get the developers engaged. And the VR community is kind of split between two groups of folks, right? There's these large developers, and they could be doing many things, right? It could be on the consumer side with Facebook, or, on the health side, there's tons of these companies doing this great work. And those companies are going to be convinced. They have all the analysis and all kind of the business acumen to know that accessibility needs to be a part of their business. And they can have customers drive requirements, especially on, the commercials or on the B2B side. But these smaller developers, which is where a ton of the innovation is happening right now, right? And these smaller developers are either going to go to the bigger developers eventually, or become them, or, be the people giving the talks. We need to make sure that these people are also engaged. These folks know that, they have the resources to know how to address these problems, but they also have the awareness too, right? Some kind of way of getting them to understand that this is a area that they need to address as they're building their experiences.
Terrific. So I'm going to sort of come back to a broader aperture here a little bit. And I know some of you have already referenced some very amazing applications, but just to give a sense to the audience, what are some of the coolest applications or most exciting applications that you're seeing out there in the accessibility space? And I will start, I was thinking about, I think it's called mobile VR, this concept that people that have disabilities that prevent them from moving, walking, being ambulatory, can use like handsets now to get around a particular virtual environment. So I was thinking about things like that, but it could manifest itself in really cool games like Rest of Us 2. So I'm just curious, what's really piquing your interest in this sort of like a top area of great applications or use in accessibility?
I can jump in real quick to start. I'll just take the gaming side of things. So on the games not XR side, I know that the new Miles Morales Spider-Man game just did a big accessibility update. Really cool stuff. Big thread out there. You should all check it out. That is regular gaming, but I have a list of a few games that have been forging, besides the Alchemy games, kind of a path with that. So Dead and Buried 2 is the example Oculus uses. They have a lot of good indicators in their game for audio. As well as it's a simple enough game that it lends itself well to that. We saw Moss. Vader Immortal has some really good stuff as a broadly accessible experience with a bunch of different things. And then if you are lucky enough to have access to one of the high fidelity, like super high fidelity systems, Valve's Half-Life Alyx has a number of different options, and Valve is committed. They're one of the first companies that put like true captioning with sound effects in their games, and they continue that with Half-Life Alyx. It's very cool.
Yeah, Christian is nodding his head.
I am a strong supporter of the Half-Life captioned Horizon Zero Dawn. That's a game that I really like. That has a lot of choices for accessibility, so it can show where your enemy's coming and that kind of thing. I think it's not perfect, but it's the best way it's the best example that I have to compare to other games about the way that you're able to respond in that game because of the accessibility options. So I think that's another game that should be included in some of this research and investigation about what can be done about accessibility.
Great. Christopher, anything top of mind for you?
It's not a game per se, but there's a really neat research project that was put out a couple of months ago called Wearable Captions, where it's a pair of glasses that has microphones and you actually can see captions in real life. So for me, I'm always interested in the toys. And this is something that I think is it's not a product, it's a research project, but I think it really shows some of the potential of different form factors.
Yeah. Well, I think we're getting to the end of our session, but I think what I'm excited about is that we have awareness about the need for accessibility in this technology. B, we understand we need to do a lot of outreach to people to make sure they're included in part of this process. And C, some of the amazing innovations, whether it's through gaming or now these research projects, are really showing an incredible pathway forward. What I like about that is, going back to my comments at the beginning, this is going to be a computing platform that goes well beyond gaming, and how we operate in the workplace is going to be dependent on XR, in my view. So it's vital that we get right now what makes this technology accessible and useful for everybody, no matter what environment they're operating in. So I want to thank everybody. Any last words for the South by gang? Otherwise,
build accessible experiences.
There you go. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your joining us today. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.